4. We're not doing Becca. I'm guessing Chris is going to be out. I'm guessing Maris is. I know Maris is out. So that may be the only 4 people. Where the hell are my students? That's where it was. Sarah, Kalia. So 4 and 8. Got 12 students now. Should have at least 2 more. Hey everybody.
Hey Jeff. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes. Sorry, I was managing my waiting room here. I think we have a couple more people coming in, but I didn't want to keep everybody waiting. So I'll just keep adding my people as they come. So I got 14 students, 4 people speaking. And as I'm just waiting for the last couple of students, which I'm not really going to give them much more time, I just want to make sure the 4 of you guys who are speaking, are you okay if I record this only for students who weren't able to make it today?
Fine.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I will get started. And I want to start with a very clear, huge thank you to the 4 of you that are here to speak and tell your stories. We did have a couple of other people who last minute weren't able to be here, but this is kind of a weird group of people because you kind of hit a bunch of areas of my life. Some of you I don't even know. It's sort of just like an explosion of everybody kind of coming together, which is cool. So just to give you guys who are telling your story a little bit of perspective and why I'm trying to do this and the thing here is that the textbook, obviously, I had just posted up the chapter on this, and we've got 3 chapters. We've got one related to depression, we've got one related to treatment, and one related to suicide. But the chapter on suicide is so clinical. It talks about different types of suicide and kind of statistics and stuff like that. And it doesn't really get to the heart of what happens and how it affects people and what kind of things you wish you had noticed, or things that you did see, or the pain that you felt. So I feel like these stories are particularly important to explain what it is really about. So the text being clinical is bad. The fact that the course is asynchronous makes it that much worse, because the majority of this is me recording a video for the students to watch when they can. So I wanted to try and get some of these Zoom calls so they can interact with real people talking about real things. So that's where I am coming from. And I was kind of amazed at how many people wanted to be part of this, which really tells me how important you all feel like getting these stories out are. So that is kind of my intro to this. I'll start it off by asking you to tell your story, to talk about what happened and how you were affected, and who the person was that affected you, maybe what preceded things, how the family and friends were affected afterwards. Students, I really encourage you to ask questions, because this is a chance that you might not have again, to have this many people this open to talk about things. So I really want to make sure we get the best out of that. So you can either turn on your video and ask a question, you could ask it in the chat and I'll pass it along. I will jot down some questions myself, but I just want to get the most out of the time that people have really generously offered to do this. So, I guess that said, if nobody has any questions getting started, maybe we can kick it off with the four of you. Sarah, I know you may have to cut yours short, so I don't know if you wanted to begin. I also know you have no problem speaking to people.
Well, that's true. I don't, and I appreciate that. Actually, I'm at home with my 4-year-old son, and my husband was supposed to be here, but he got called into work. So right now we're good, but I don't know if any of you have children, but it's like a ticking time bomb any second. But sure, I don't have a problem speaking to people. And actually, suicide is it's a part of my life. Actually, it's really weird that it is, but I've had multiple situations in my life, unfortunately, where suicide has affected me, and it's affected myself and my family directly. So can you all hear me okay? Because I'm using my Bluetooth just so that my son doesn't hear all of our stories today. But so I think maybe the first story that I will tell, there's two really significant ones, and I think they're both important and they're both very different. So I'm going to tell you about both of them. When I was 16 years old, I grew up in a place that was nothing like it is here. I grew up literally in the middle of nowhere in Northeast Pennsylvania. And hold on one second, sorry. Are you hungry? Okay, just give me 1 second. In the middle of Northeast Pennsylvania, and I had a friend who was my best friend. I had a group of friends actually, and they were my best friends. And one of them, her name was Jess. Her boyfriend, who was another part of this group of friends, his name was Rich. And he had a troubled life. He did. And I don't know if any of you know what it's like to grow up in farm country in the middle of nowhere. I grew up on literally 400 acres. But your friends are your friends literally from the time you're born until you leave, really. And there's not a lot of people. So the people that you have are very close, very strong connections. So we literally all grew up together. Well, Rich, really long story short, but when we were 16 years old, he hung himself on his front porch. And it was a situation where it was totally unexpected totally unexpected. Like I don't need to go into the details of like telling you about our friendships and telling you about our lives, because I could be here all day, but I can tell you that at 16 years old, to come to school and to find out from a random friend that your best friend had hung himself that morning was very challenging, very challenging. And we all found out that way. And my friend Rich and I, we actually didn't go to the same school, but because it was such a small population, literally everyone was affected. And the importance, I think, of this story is that, first of all, I was so very young, and it affected me differently than my adult experience. And also, he wasn't a family member, he was a friend. And the second one was a family member for me. And also because I had a lot of learning to do based upon that experience, because, well, a lot of learning about suicide and different factors that are involved in being able to detect whether or not it's going to happen to someone, or it's a risk, or it's a fear, and also having to deal with that loss. And like, I'm sure some of you who have been directly affected by suicide can attest to the fact that there's this whole process of grieving that you have to go through that is a little bit different than when somebody dies because they're sick or something else along those lines, because there's a lot of anger that comes along with it too, that you also have to learn how to deal with. So, and being young and, you know, your right frontal lobe still developing and not being able to reason, that also made it very challenging for us. So we started to go through well, our school was really amazing because they developed some programs for us and our friend group to kind of learn about suicide and learn how to detect whether or not it was going on with anyone else in our friend group, and also to try and get through the grieving process to deal with what we were supposed to expect to happen in the future, what we were going through as of that time, and also how long it was going to take, because it took a really long time for us to get over it, a really long time. Life just completely changed literally overnight. So I don't know like what kind of specifics you would want me to describe about that experience, Jeff, but I can tell you that one thing that came very specifically from that experience was us figuring out that there were some cues that we could have seen that we didn't know to look for, that we were sort of learning through this process to sort of see in the future. And then another aspect of it for me was that I got very, very depressed, but for a lot of reasons, and being young and growing up is hard. But I sort of had this interesting thing happen to me where I knew that no matter how frustrating life ever got, I would never even begin to contemplate suicide because of the effect that my friend so young taking his life had on myself and his family, and on my family. So it was sort of like a really terrible thing that happened that also was kind of a blessing, because it taught me a valuable lesson about how valuable life really, really is and was. And I think at 16, that's a really, really hard thing to go through and a hard thing to learn. So I don't know if like, Jeff, you have any questions for what that was like for me, or anything specific, or if anybody else does, but that's my first story.
Let me unmute. I think what might be good is to hear all of the stories first. And then I know I'm jotting down some notes because I think that there may be some overlap in terms of questions. Great. And then that way everybody could kind of chime in on how their particular situation was, you know, how that played out.
Great. Awesome. So then I'll just tell you real fast. The second time that I dealt with suicide was actually 6 years ago. my cousin committed suicide. And ironically enough, it's interesting to me, but he also hung himself. And that was pretty awful. And the thing about my cousin was he dealt with a lot of mental health issues for pretty much his whole life. And along with those issues, he's just from a broken home. And also, he, whether you have opinions about his lifestyle or not, I'm positive that he came out of the womb gay. And it was actually really, really hard for him to live in a society that was very unaccepting as he grew up of his lifestyle, because it's much more accepted now. But even 6 years ago, it wasn't as accepted as it is now. And he felt very lost for pretty much forever. And I know that that was a very big factor in the reason why he took his life. And everything, he would always tell me that everything just seems so much harder because of his lifestyle, but he couldn't change the person who he was. And the thing about my cousin is we were similar in age, and we were very, very close. So it was really, really hard to lose him. And my reaction to losing him was actually very different than my reaction to losing my friend when I was so much younger, because still, even to this day, I'm very angry with him for what he did. And I am still trying to figure out how to deal with that anger. And so much so, I mean, I'm not holding back, I'm being honest. I try not to think about him a whole lot. And I know that that is a reaction that I'm having because of the whole guilt process. And I told you it was 6 years ago that he hung himself, but he never met my daughter. And that was, so she was just about a year old at the time. And I was very angry with him for that. I was very angry with him for not trying harder. I was just angry with him. And I'm not as angry with him now, but I go back and forth for sure. So like the grieving process with that loss is very, very different. And also sometimes it's strange, but I sort of like disassociate from my relationship with him sometimes. And I know that that is a coping mechanism to losing him. And trust me, like I've been through lots of therapy because I lost my cousin and different things like that. And it still is something that I will probably continue to deal with. But the part where I disassociate is sometimes when I get really just frustrated, especially since this pandemic started, with just life in general, and I wish I could talk to him, I sort of pretend like I didn't even know him. And he was my cousin and we grew up together. And I've learned over the years that that's a normal part of not just dealing with loss, but also dealing with loss as a result of suicide. And I know that not everybody deals with that and not everybody goes through that, but that's definitely like a very unique thing that I'm dealing with throughout that loss that was very different from the previous suicide that I dealt with. So there you have it.
Thank you for that, Sarah.
Sure.
They were two different, but definitely moving stories. I've got some questions that, like I said, I'm going to hold off until we get to hear everyone else's, because I think we're going to see some common themes. I posted up in the chat the 5 stages of grief, which I don't know if you guys have seen them in another course or not, but denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I know Sarah was just talking a lot about that anger that's still there. So let me move on to, let's see. So Randi, I've got you up in my top left corner. So are you good to tell your story?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just getting right to the point. My father took his life March 2007. And I wanted to in 2017. And I had dealt with my father with depression since I was born. in and out of hospitals. He had shock treatment, everything. And he tried to commit suicide twice when I was young, but I found out about it when I was later in life. My mom told me. And so this is a really weird thing to say, but every single time my phone rang and that number popped up, I wondered if that was the call. And one day the call came through, and he did it. He finally did it. And he was in a coma. I went to the hospital and I saw him. And even if he woke up, he would have been brain dead. So we decided to take him off life support. And yeah, I went through this anger and God, all kinds of feelings. And I think the thing that hurt the most was that the letter he wrote, he didn't put anything to my sister and I. It was to my stepmother. And, he talked about finances, and I didn't understand it. So I was very unhappy about that. And I couldn't understand why. How can you take your life and it affects so many people? I considered it selfish, went through that anger. And in 2017, I have suffered from depression since I was 9. And oh Lord, I have been through therapy, medications, the whole thing. And in some weird way, my father taking his life, and is it Beth who just spoke? Who was it that just spoke, Beth?
Sarah.
Sarah, okay. So you said about the blessing in disguise. It's the reason why I didn't take my life in 2017. But I now understand why somebody would want to do it. The pain that I felt inside, I have never in my life, I can't even explain it. It was so horrible. I just wanted it to go away. I was in bed crying. I have 2 kids. And I can't imagine, because of how it felt when my father took his life, I can't imagine somebody telling my children, your mother is gone. And that's what kept me from not hurting myself. And all I want to do, and I want to tell you guys, I don't know if this is like, is this a major? Is this, I think it's great that you're taking this class because you want to help people. I think it's wonderful. I've tried different options of trying to help people with mental illness, and it's really hard for me because I want to help everybody. The feeling that I felt in 2017, the only way I can explain it is you're in a coffin and you can't breathe and it's dark. That's the only way to explain it. So, and with my father, I've hit acceptance. I went through all of it. I miss him. I wish that he could see my children grow up. But I get it. I get it now, why he did it. And I'm lucky because I have so much support. I have so much strength. I have really good doctors, and I'm lucky I survived. And all I want to do is just help people. And if any of the students ever want to reach out and just talk to me on the side, you're more than welcome to reach out to me.
Thank you, Randi. That was hugely powerful. And I really appreciate you sharing that, especially your own thoughts, and I definitely think we'll want to explore some of that. Hopefully, people will have some questions about how you felt and how you were able to, a little bit more about how you were able to kind of pull out of it. Because I mean, one of the big things that kind of jumps out at me too is here you are 4 years later and you're able to talk about it, which kind of blows me away. It's you felt that pain so intensely, yet found another, the other side of it. So that's something I would definitely, as we talk for the next hour or so, I definitely want to get into that a little bit more. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Teresa,
Hello,
feel good to be up?
I'm up. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being interested enough to participate in this conversation. I'm going to tell you about the person. I lost my brother to suicide 3 years ago, and I was thinking about talking about this last night, and part of it for me is that, and you guys may have experienced something similar, but there's a lot of people who have things happen in their life, and there's a before it happened and there's an after it happened. And a lot of times mental illness, the onset happens in late teens to early 20s. And it can rob people of their lives. And that's what happened to my brother. He was the dopest dude. He was a really awesome guy. He had tons of friends. He played soccer. He was a brilliant musician. And right as he graduated from high school, he developed a mental illness that robbed him of a lot of things in his life. And I think part of my reservation, or sort of like about talking about him, is that I knew him before. So I knew Nelson, who was really amazing and had all this stuff going for him. But when I talk about him now in the after, I worry that people are going to only hear that he hung himself and that he was mentally ill. And they're not going to realize that that was just a part of who he was. That was not by any stretch the whole of who he was. And in fact, part of my story is his mental illness went undiagnosed for his entire life. He died when he was 44. And we didn't catch on that we were dealing with a mental illness until probably a year before he died, which sounds bananas. His mental illness had to do with paranoia. He had paranoid thoughts. And starting at I was 4 years, I'm 4 years older than he was. And starting when he was in college, he started telling me stories that were just like weird, about like neighbors, like people upstairs in his apartment that he knew were doing things to try to mess with him. And on their surface, I knew those stories weren't true. I just knew it wasn't true. It didn't make any sense, but I didn't call it out. I was a big sister in every sense of the word, which means I was super protective of him. I loved him with my whole heart, and I just didn't want anything to be wrong. And ironically, I'm in mental health and I have a background in psychology, and all of it went past me. Fast forward, he got very sensitive. I always just said, Nelson's sensitive. Like you could be talking to him and then say something to him and it would hurt his feelings. And he would be very hurt, inwardly hurt for a long time. He'd carry that with him. And sometimes you'd find out months later that you had offended him. And it got to the point where I didn't even want him to be like, I wanted him to be so okay that I didn't even want him to hang out with me and my friends, because I was so worried that they would say something that would, trigger him in some way. But I still didn't make the connection that what I was dealing with was a mental illness. But I knew he struggled. he worked at a library. He ended up dropping out of college and he got a job at a library, but eventually he said that talking to people all day was just too much. He couldn't do it. So he went to the library and asked them if he could clean it instead. Can I just come in at night and clean your library? And they said yes. So my brother was a janitor and it worked for him. So he had a job the whole time. He was very functional in a lot of ways. And he, even with the paranoia, there were certain people that never got cut out of his life. He lost a lot of people because of things he thought they were doing to him that weren't true. And I can remember him saying things like, God, I really thought I was going to make a friend there. But, you know, then they did this thing that was never was a thing. But he never turned his back on me or my other siblings or my dad or my mom. After my mom died, it got a lot worse. My dad, a lot of things that happened in our family, tumultuous stuff. My dad is gay and he came out of the closet when we were all adults, and he took off and moved across the country because that's what happened. But it was very traumatic for my brother. It was very traumatic for my mom. And I think it had a big impact on him too. At any rate, 11 years ago, I got pregnant and I had a son. And I wanted Nelson to know that I saw value in him, because sometimes it's like, I just knew he was having such a hard time and I knew he didn't feel like he was worth very much. And there's one thing to love somebody, but there's another thing to value them. And so I wanted him to know that I value you and I think you have so much worth that I'm going to name my kid after you. And so I did. So I have two Nelsons. I have my brother and I have my son. 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, Nelson, my brother, came to my house and he said, my neighbor across the street wants to kill me. And I said, what are you talking about? And he had a video in which he was seeing a red light. There was across the street neighbor, and there was a red light that was moving back and forth in this neighbor's home. I don't know what it was. My brother was convinced that it was a rifle scope and that they were scoping him to kill him. And at the time, I felt like I was actually scared for him because I couldn't decide if it was real. But anyway, that was the beginning of really crazy stories. And it dawned on me at some point, he came to my house and he said, the neighbor has hired people who work for Verizon, which is the phone company. I don't know if that's national or not, but to follow me. And they're following me to work. There was a Verizon truck outside my job. And that's when I knew something was that was the first time it had to get that blatant for me to be like, wait a minute, what is happening? I was scared to talk to him about it. I was terrified to talk to him about it. I wanted him to be okay. And I think I thought if I talk to him, it will be worse. So I didn't talk to him. What I did do was I went and found a clinician. I went to a therapist and I said, here's what's happening with my brother. What do I do? What should I do? And the therapist and I decided that my brother was engaged with my family. He came over every week to see me and my family. He was very close to Nelson, his nephew. He had a job that he was successfully working. And so the therapist said, don't do anything. This is probably baseline. He's functioning, and if things change, maybe think about doing something else. But for now, what you should do is validate his feelings, but don't try to engage or tell him that he's wrong. People with paranoia have a really hard time accepting people challenging their belief systems. They begin to distrust you if you do that. And I fully embrace that as a concept. So I tried to validate his feelings and I didn't confront him on what I thought were obviously things that weren't true. And 3 years ago, on my son's 8th birthday, we went to dinner with Nelson for the last time. My siblings were there, my husband and my son. And Nelson was super withdrawn. He didn't talk to Nelson Cooper, my son, very much, which was really unusual. They were really, really, really tight. And at the end of the meal, we all got together. It was at an Italian restaurant, and somebody took a picture of us. My brother had given my son a gift that was in a paper bag that he had like kind of decorated. And we took this picture. And afterwards, when I saw the picture, I realized that the bag that he was holding, so he's holding it like this, and we're all just like grouped around, and Nelson's with him. And on the bag is written, always remember, I love you. He died 3 days later. So I know in my heart that he probably knew he was going. And as we left that restaurant that night, he ghosted us. He tried to like slide out without like hugging, and we're a hugging and kissing family. You're not leaving till we've all like had some spit shared. And he was going without doing that. And my son ran to him and said, I love you. Where are you going? And he said, oh, I love you too. And he left. And that was the end. That was the end. We didn't, anyway, that was it. Yeah, so that was it. And it was catastrophic. It was a catastrophic loss to me. I felt so protective of him, and I loved him so much, and I wanted so much more for him than what he got. And mental illness can really rob people. It really just robs people of their lives sometimes. And then that's what happened to Nelson. So I've never experienced anger. Never, because I can't imagine finding the world so difficult that the recourse you find for yourself is to not be there anymore. To think about hurting myself to the point of no longer being alive is hard to fathom. So the fact that people do think like that gives me great pause, and I have deep, deep empathy for people feeling like that. I will say, in the year after Nelson died, I also became suicidal for a period of probably 4 months, and they were the blackest, darkest. I mean, there are not words to describe what it felt like. I had a good therapist. She was working with me, and she said to me, similar to what someone else said, like, you can't do this because you know what it's like, and you can't do this to your kid. And she said, you have to go home and tell your husband. You have to go home and tell him right away. So I did. And I have a wonderful husband. Let that be out there too. Super supportive, very close to me, very close to my whole family. And we had a plan that if I really felt like I was going to hurt myself, that I would come and tell them. The problem is, being suicidal makes you a liar. And I lied to them a lot. And it's by the grace of moments that I'm alive. The impulse is so strong that it's almost beyond your control. There was one time I left, I was in a group for suicide survivors, and I was driving home from a support group, and I literally thought to myself, drive to his house, drive to Nelson's house, and hang yourself in the high tower, which is where high tower is like a thing gardeners use to, it's like a tunnel thing outside that people can grow food in. Anyway, that's where he died, and I was going to go do it. And somebody called me, and it broke the spell for that moment. But that was the closest I ever came, and it was happening. It was going to happen, which just sounds now in hindsight, I mean, it's bananas, but it was so real at the time. It was so real at the time. And I'm haunted by the fact that, you know, I'm sure we've all heard the analogy that if you throw a pebble into a calm pond and it creates all these ripples that can go all the way to either end of the pond. Suicide is not a pebble in a pond. It's a freaking bomb. And its reach is catastrophic. It can touch so many people in so many ways. And once there's a suicide in an immediate group, the risk for other people to complete suicide goes up exponentially. So one of the things that for me that has been huge is I've worried about what burden I've placed on my Nelson. they were very, very close. And I named my son after someone who ultimately took their life. And I know that my son is he's 11. He's an emotional, empathetic person. And he's going to have to go through adolescence and young adulthood when, stuff can be really hard. And the way you feel about things can be really out of sorts, and hormones can be tough. And I don't want him to know that this is an avenue that might be available to him. I don't want him to make an impulsive decision that's going to last the rest of my life, ultimately. So those are the kind of things that I battle with. And that's sort of my little story in a nutshell. Do you want to see a picture of my brother? Can I show you a picture? Okay, hold on. So this, I don't know if, can you see that? Sun.
Yeah.
Is it going through at all or no?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so this is both of my Nelsons. That's my son and that's my brother. And they're two of the best people I've ever met. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Teresa.
Sure.
Wow, that was kind of hard to get through without being emotional. And there's a couple things that, again, I know I'll come back to. One of the things that sort of jumped out to me, though, is that you're in the field and it had gone past you. And I think that is a really important thing to mention too, is that when you are in it, it's completely different than when you are learning about it, helping others with it. It's just, and that's with mental health in general. So I do think that is important, and something that I will bring up again in a little bit. But I also want to make sure that my other old friend Janet there gets a chance to tell her story as well. Janet, Mrs. Spalding. You're on mute, Mrs. Spalding.
There we go. Now I'm unmuting.
Janet is
I had to do
also a teacher at Immaculata and was my daughter's old library teacher as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
we have
And Jeff and I went to college together. My story, I have two different aspects, much as Randi did, and Teresa. The first story I'll speak of is the suicide that touched my life. Was a very good friend of mine in high school, Jim. And you have to sort of transport yourself back to the mystical age of 1989, which for some of us, it doesn't seem like it's that long ago, but 31 years. Very similar to others, he at the time had mental illness. He was untreated, undiagnosed bipolar, which in the 80s and 90s, we talk about the stigma for mental health issues these days. Late 80s, early 90s, you bootstrapped it. Really, if you were in therapy, it was seen as weakness. Any medications that were available were very crude and fairly ineffective. And nice people don't talk about their mental illness or any mental illness that's in the family. So it's not the Victorian era, lock your crazy aunt or uncle up in the attic and pretend they don't exist, but put a good face on it and pretend it doesn't exist. It'll all be fine. And Jim had all of the characteristic highs and lows that went with bipolar. When he was manic, he was the most amazing, spontaneous, amusing, fun person to be around. There was always something amazing about him. And in the back of our heads, we all knew that this mania wasn't appropriate and wasn't normal, that it was probably an indication that something was wrong. But we were all having fun because we were young and we were in high school. And his lows were very, very low, very not get out of bed for days low. not eating, not bathing, not interacting with people. It wasn't that unusual for him to disappear for a couple days at a time. And we never knew if that meant he'd taken his tent and gone camping because he couldn't deal with people anymore, or if he just couldn't get out of bed. One of those times, he took his tent, he went out to the woods, and at some point during his 2 or 3 day interlude, he did hang himself. He had a place where he usually went. I'm trying to think. The best I can give you is like A.A. Milne's Pooh's Thoughtful Spot. He had one place he really liked to camp, and we all knew that that's usually where he gravitated towards when he was having a difficult time. And he almost always came back after 2 or 3 days. So he was gone for 3 days, and his parents started calling around. You know, Jim was having a hard time. We think he went camping. Has anybody seen him or heard from him? And nobody had. 3 days became 5 days. 5 days became 7 days. On the 8th day, his family finally reported him missing to the police. And we started looking. They sent people out to look. And of course, the 3 or 4 of us that were good friends with him went to his thoughtful spot, which is where he was. 9 days in the woods unattended was not the most calming or appetizing sight to run across, particularly for people who were in high school and really unequipped to deal with what they found. So, you know, he had killed himself. The estimate was that he had killed himself a week before. Sarah had spoken of the groups and things that her school had put into place to help them. Again, this was 1989. We didn't talk about it. No one in any official capacity ever said the word suicide. No one ever acknowledged that he had harmed himself. In any communication, it was that he died. He died suddenly and unexpectedly. No one said he hurt himself. Right up to the funeral that the church held for him, there was very much an avoidance of any talk of suicide or mental illness. There was no talk of how he struggled. There was no talk about how we all knew he was having issues. There was no talk about how we all felt maybe his parents could have put him in therapy or done more to help him. He was just gone. There was a precisely Jim-shaped cutout. I said Jeff because I'm looking at you, Jeff. There was a precisely Jim-shaped cutout in all of our lives where not only was he gone, we didn't speak of it again because no one wanted to address untreated mental illness. Nobody wanted to address the suicide. So we were all kind of flung out there and look, make your way, make your peace. It's up to you. Even his parents never spoke of him again. Which, speaking of anger, I'm still very angry about that because it's as if he didn't exist. But as Randi and Teresa have alluded to, suicide is very pernicious. And then when you come to a difficult point in your own life, because someone has gone before you, it's easier to think, well, the options on the table. In 2007, I had my son. He is now 16. I have 3 kids. He is my middle child. With my first pregnancy, my eldest daughter, I had preterm labor and I was on bed rest for like half of my pregnancy. When she arrived, I was too busy to think about, my mental health, or I didn't really have time to be depressed. With my son, my pregnancy was picture perfect. Labor and delivery was picture perfect. And postpartum depression landed on me like an anvil. And that was something that people didn't ordinarily address. Again, it wasn't really, after the Andrew Yates case in Texas, certainly postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis were more addressed. But nobody tells you that your hormones are insane, that your entire body and your entire life and your entire lifestyle has changed. And if you complain about it, if you bring up any problems that you're having, and I know maybe, I know Sarah has children, I know Teresa has children, I believe Randi has kids as well. If you complain, if you voice discomfort or unhappiness, people's automatic response is, why are you upset? You have a beautiful baby. Isn't life wonderful? For me, it wasn't. I felt unprepared, even though it was my second child. I felt absolutely unworthy of the blessings I had. I certainly wasn't doing anything right and would never be able to figure out how to do it right. And everybody would be much better if I could go away and other people could step in and take care of my kids, because clearly I was going to fuck it all up. I was going to screw it all up. I couldn't ask my husband for help because he's working and supporting the family. I couldn't ask my parents for help because they were too far away. I had a 2.5-year-old and a newborn. And although I had all the support in the world, I had no support at all in my head. There was no way I could do this. And so I started to make plans for not having to do it anymore. I started making sure that there was food and supplies in the house. There were enough diapers in the closet. I started making sure that my husband knew all the online banking passwords and where all the accounts were and how to access and when the bills were due. I started, writing on the calendar house maintenance things that I knew had to be accomplished that it wouldn't occur to him to do because I always did them. And I started to make my plan. And finally, because I'm a little control freaky, I decided that everything was as good as I was going to get it. Everything was as organized as I could get it. Anything that I hadn't covered, they'd have to figure out. And I dropped my kids off at my mother-in-law's house. And on the way home, I stopped at St. Joseph's Church in Downingtown. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to hell. And I might as well apologize to God before I went. And the pastor at the time came in and said, "You haven't been doing so well. What's going on with you?" No one had asked at that point. No one had recognized that I was struggling. And as Teresa points out, you do a lot of lying. No, it's fine. I'm good. Just tired. Just tired was my code phrase. Just tired. Just tired, newborn kids, tired. And he sat down next to me in the pew. He didn't look me in the face. He just bumped me with his shoulder. And he said, "You haven't been doing so well, have you? Let's talk about that." And I did. He put me in his car. He took me to my doctor, put his arm around me, walked me into her office and said, "Jenna needs some help. Here's what we need to do." And I walked out of there with a therapist, and I walked out of there with a prescription for antidepressants. And I walked out of there with someone who called me 3 times a day. "How you doing? You okay? What's your problem today? How can I help?" That pastor saved my life. Every day he called me, at least twice a day, until I got my feet up underneath of me, until I was capable of expressing that I needed help and accepting it, because there were a lot of times when people would offer help and I would be like, no, I got this. I can do this. I can do everything. So, from two perspectives, the undiagnosed mental illness and the inability of my friend to get help in high school, and my inability to recognize that crazy hormones and an overwhelming schedule and generally an inability to ask other people for help were both leading to the same path. As Sarah and Teresa and Randi have also mentioned, there are almost always signs. I'm sure that I was probably broadcasting to everybody who cared to look what I was going through and what I needed. But we're conditioned to not pry into other people's lives and to not pay too much close attention to that, to let them do their thing. You do you, boo. That's what we say to people. However, suicide isn't a rock in a pond with ripples. It is a bomb. Jim's family suffered dreadfully after his suicide. His younger sister attempted suicide a few years later because he'd paved the way for her. I know that if I had hurt myself, I would have been setting my children up to consider that solution down the line somewhere. Suicide almost progresses geometrically in families and friend groups. If one person does it, it's like tipping a domino, and other people who were thinking about it, or other people who were in bad places, it leads them down a path. I don't know what else much to say other than, obviously I am in a better place now. I have my therapist, I have my medication, I have lots of other things to focus me most useful. I have the will and the ability to ask for help when I'm struggling, which is a very hard thing for many people to get to. So there we go. Poor Jeff, who's never heard any of this, is probably getting out of it. But I'll mute myself and let Jeff talk over his comments.
Thank you for sharing. I did not know that, and wow. So I'm going to try to be a good moderator here. And I've got political jokes I could make there, but I'm not going to. So anyway, one of the big things that I'm thinking about is when you all agreed to speak. I'm thinking, okay, well, and actually my wife had even said, okay, so you've got people coming in to speak about their experiences and people who have thought about it themselves. And I said, no, I actually just have people coming in to speak about their experiences and how it affected them. And I think it's interesting that 3 out of the 4 of you talked directly about how you had also had those feelings. So, I'm making these notes about how, exactly like what Janet was talking about at the end, about how it is pernicious, almost contagious, really, about how it opens up a door for people that you may never have considered before. And I think that is a huge thing that I kind of want to talk about is, first, for those of you who felt that way because you had experienced it, what was the difference, do you think? What, obviously the people that had come before you did not have the same end. They were not able to navigate those waters, and you were. And I think that that's amazing. What was the difference, do you think, if you had to compare between you and them? Because in a lot of ways, you guys were very intimately connected.
Well, I guess for me, I feel like my time was, I need to talk quietly. I didn't realize my son could hear me. So I've blown his mind a little today. But I think for me, it was that I had a therapist that was relentless about telling me to think. Well, basically what she said is you can't. It's just not on the table. It's not an option, because you know what it's doing. And you're going to kill other people if you do this. Contagious is a brilliant word to describe it. So part of it was that relentless messaging that you just cannot do this to other people. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're suffering and we understand that, but you cannot do this to other people. And thinking about it as something that would be done to other people did impact me, because I didn't want to make anybody else sad. What I wanted to do was stop feeling sad myself. The other piece was mine was very much circumstantial. I don't have depression. I don't have a mental illness. I don't have a substance abuse problem. I had a loss of someone that I had a hard time believing was gone. So in some ways I had that going for me. Do you know what I mean? That was in my favor, that I didn't have underlying predisposition.
I think for me, I don't want to be like my dad. That's it. Bottom line. Did not want to be like him. And, my dad, funny as it may sound, he was a doctor. And, but my father could not get through his head that medication takes you to a certain point. And when you hit that certain point, then you got to work on yourself. And he didn't have the strength to do that. He wanted medication. He wanted everything outside of him to help him. And I'll never be like my father. And that's what keeps me going.
Amen, sister.
I think in my case, number one, again, we're talking in the late 80s, early 90s. Therapy as a joke on Saturday Night Live, medication being non-existent or very crude. Seeing the lasting effect that Jim's suicide had on his parents, who seemed to age 80 years overnight, on his little sister, remembering that and thinking, wow, that's what I would put my family through. I think the fact that somebody saw through all of the bullshit I was throwing in the air to obfuscate and cover for how I was really feeling and what I really intended. One person looking through that cloud and going, I see you. You're having a problem. and to be able to acknowledge that, you know what, I had just had a baby. Everybody talks about how blissful and wonderful it is. No one talks about your hormones being out of control and your body being out of your control and not really your own, if you're nursing or healing from labor and delivery, or all of the things that go into that. I guess for me, after having, after the pastor taking care of me and my doctor taking care of me, to look at it and go, wow, that would have been a really permanent solution to something that was temporary. Your body does get not back to 100% normal, but it gets back to healthy. Your hormones calm down and go back to doing what they're supposed to do after the shock. Newborns do sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Eventually, that light at the end of the tunnel, that's not a train, that's an actual end to the overwhelming position you find yourself in, I think is the part that was the most helpful.
So, I mean, I think everybody here has talked about how someone has kind of saved their life, whether it was the actual person that they lost or another person, the pastor in your case. I'm wondering if we're looking at this I would think if there is a question that is bubbling up in students' minds that they're not saying, because I'm psychic, I can read your minds. I'm guessing they're thinking, what do I do if I know somebody who is struggling? How do I tell? How do I be that person that saves their life? And I don't know that you guys necessarily have the answer, but I think that becomes one of the big questions for all of us. If you are, obviously you can go the realm of, hey, what if you're the one feeling it? But what if we're the ones who are the support system? What do we say? What do we do? I think, I forget which one of you said, but it may have been Janet that said just somebody was absolutely honest with you, and people aren't honest anymore because you just try to kind of let people do their own thing. And at what point do you jump in and not feel funny about doing it?
Ask. I can honestly say, after my own experience, I've lost all shame and embarrassment about asking. How are you doing? Is everything okay? You seem like you're having a hard time. You haven't sounded like yourself lately. You look like you're not sleeping. Ask. I have been in a position to do that for many other people. Being a college professor and teaching freshmen, I can look out and pick out the ones who are struggling and take a minute to say, hey, you okay? You look like you're a little overwhelmed. You need a minute? Ask. That connection is so important. Knowing that one other person can see you and is at least picked up on the fact that you're struggling a little bit is sometimes the difference. Hey, Sarah, I noticed that you've had the kids to yourself for a couple days. That can be exhausting. Why don't I order out burgers and we'll sit down together and have a meal? Go take a nap. I'll let the kids scream at me for an hour. Teresa, you tired of driving your kid all over the place because they have to be in 20 different places at once? I'm going to be in that area. Why don't you let me do it? Take a night off, have a glass of wine. Jeff, you don't want to coach volleyball tonight. Why don't you let me sit on the sidelines and scream at people?
Yeah.
Ask. If post 9/11, we've heard, if you see something, say something. That's not just security. That's people around you. If you see something, say something. That's my take on it anyway.
I think that's wonderful. That is a great a great sentiment. I don't think people are given that allowance to do that. I think, thank you for telling people that they're allowed to do that. Even if the people you tell get annoyed with you for asking, which that happens to me all the time. Stop asking me. Hey, that's my job. I care about you. What about if you're on the other side of things? And I know we only have but so much time, and I do want to give students a chance to ask, and I'm not trying to steal all the good questions, but what if you are on the other side of things? What if somebody here that's listening is feeling these things or struggling with something that they're not comfortable telling somebody else, or that they've experienced it and are pushing their stuff down? What would you guys say to them other than the obvious?
You can give them my cell number. Honestly, you can reach out to me. I don't care if I don't know you. It's hard, man. Janet, I get it. Like, I'm still like that because I don't want to be a burden. I think a lot of people feel that way. You just say, I'm not doing good. Something, just say something to anybody. And you know what? Even if you have to call, there's NAMI, there's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have numbers you can call to talk about it, but just reach out. You saw what happened with Janet. It took one person.
I'm going to put that
That-
link in there for NAMI. And
I think that's all it ever takes, is just one person. And, pick that one person in your life that is safe, that is comfortable. Go sit next to them in the cafeteria and say, you know what? Damn, I'm overwhelmed. I need a minute. Send that email or that Instagram message. Heck, scream into the void that is TikTok. whatever communication you have, put it out there. I'm having a hard time, a little overwhelmed. Because if you throw it out there, it's like fishing. You throw the bait out there, somebody's going to bite and ask what's going on. And then someone will talk to you. Someone will be there to help. You just need to throw that invitation out.
Yeah. And I like the fact that, even if you feel like there isn't somebody, one of your peers or one of your friends or whatever, you literally have 5 people at the top of the screen right now who can. And I think that's important for you to realize as well.
Can I share a story though, that I think, first of all, can I also say that in terms of taking care of other people, you have to give yourself permission to not completely carry other people. Do you know what I mean? Like, people who are hell-bent on killing themselves are often going to succeed. And people who are left behind are left with a lifetime of what could I have done? And it often leads to a lot more hurt for you. And sometimes the answer is there might not have been anything you could have done. But to Janet's point, saying something, acting immediately, take a lesson from me. Don't think you can ignore something away. For sure, speak, but just know that you may not be enough. And that's okay too, for your own self. And I lost what I was going to actually say. What were we talking about? Oh, I had a friend a year ago, a friend of mine called me while I was at work one day, and she was screaming. And what I could figure out after listening to her for a few minutes is that her father had shot himself and had died in the front yard of her home, of her mother's home. And she's like, I need help and I need it right now. So I called the National Suicide Hotline. And I want to just share my experience because I think it's useful to people who may need to know this. The way that system operates is that you go into a call bank and then you have to tell them where you're calling from. And then they go and they find a clinician who's in your area to talk to you, because they're assuming that if you need help, they're going to need to have people ready to respond to you immediately. The problem was I sat on hold for 48 minutes before I hung up, trying to find resources in the area. She lived in Indiana and I'm in Virginia. So I was trying to explain to them, I need help from somebody who's not with me. So I sat for 48 minutes on the call and before I hung up. And all I kept thinking was, what if I was calling for myself? And what if this was the moment that I needed that connection and I couldn't get it? So one of my takeaways has been, if you're struggling, to make a deal with yourself that you'll make no moves to harm yourself while you're feeling your blackest. Because in those moments when you're going to make decisions that are impulsive and that aren't really in your best interest, you're trying to find a long-term solution to a very immediate problem. So I do think one of the techniques that people use who get through this is making deals with themselves, because sometimes you don't have the ability to say to someone else, I'm going to freaking hurt myself. And it could happen like now. That's really hard to say. But you might be able to say to yourself, while I'm feeling like this, like I'm getting up and I'm going to go do it right now, that I will agree with myself not to do it right then. That's not my moment. I might have a moment, but that's not going to be the one. Because if you can push yourself out just a little bit further, just to give yourself a few more minutes, sometimes that is all that it takes. So that's my takeaway. And that's my advice, is that if you can't find it within yourself to say to somebody else, I'm at a place where I might break right now, then make the deal with yourself that if you think you're breaking, you're going to just wait 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes again, until you can find a place to talk to somebody else.
I think that's very poignant, Teresa. One of the things that I remember that stuck with me from grad school was there were two things, actually. I mean, in dealing with somebody, helping somebody with this, and this was from a clinical perspective, but the first was using the word suicide, to not pussyfoot around it, not to talk to somebody about, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Have you had thoughts of ending things? For some reason, unless you could be direct, that was one of the things that stuck with me. One of the others was, oh my God, I just lost my train of thought, like in a bad way. We were just talking about, just stop laughing, Janet. The other one was, I can't believe this. It's so embarrassing. Wait, Teresa, you were just saying about how to,
Giving yourself another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes. Okay, right. And that was it. It was about acknowledging that, I want to say this in the right way, acknowledging that suicide is an option of last resort, but that it is a reality. It is a real option in people's mind, and not to ignore the fact that is, as they're thinking about it, a solution. It's just a shitty solution. And the idea is to constantly provide other things that they could get to before then. And when you were talking about the idea of making deals with yourself for another 5 minutes, another 10 minutes, it kind of reminded me of that, where it's sort of like, you don't ignore the fact that is something, it's there, but kind of putting those other options ahead of that. So just my 2 cents is something that stuck with me back from then, and something I dealt with a neighbor in the recent kind of past with trying to do that. So I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I haven't let any students ask any questions. So I want to see, what would you like to know that you've got this prolific bunch of open and honest people? What would you like to know? What would you like to ask?
I had a question for Teresa. So when you said that your son was 8 when your brother committed suicide, how did he handle that? Like, how did you talk to him about that? How did he like go about that?
It devastated him. That was his first, well, outside of a cat, that was his first death. And of course, it was probably, outside of mom and dad, the person that he found to be the most important to him. So I immediately got him into counseling, and we had him help plan the funeral. We had the most non-traditional funeral ever. My brother, as I said, was a musician. He liked music, and he liked really cool musicians himself. So we just played really cool singer-songwriters that he liked and had slideshows of pictures. So we had my son help make a slideshow of just him and Nelson together and the things that they would do. It was really awesome. But I think too, I've been very honest with Nelson. My approach I got into the parenting game really late. I was in my 40s. So I was kind of like, I don't know, I was fully baked. So I kind of had a theory that I was just going to tell this kid whatever he needed to know. If you're going to ask me something, I'm going to tell you. And that's worked well for us because he is an emotional person who's willing to ask the questions. So I try to answer as honestly as I can. He was mad at me for not telling him that Nelson, he didn't know. So I will say that when Nelson was alive, he didn't know there was a problem. Because again, as I alluded to earlier, I didn't want him to look at Nelson differently. This was his dude. This was his person. And in every other way, most people who knew my brother didn't know that he was mentally ill. That's the other part. He hid it very, very well from almost everybody. So Nelson Cooper, my son, had said to me on occasion, "You should have told me, because if you had told me, I would have talked to him, and he never would have done this if he knew how much it was going to hurt me." Which is part of why I talk about don't take that burden on yourself. It's in an 8-year-old's head. It might make sense that he could have said something, and it might have helped for a little bit. Maybe Nelson would have stayed a little longer, but he couldn't have saved him, you know? So we talk about that a lot, about not being 100% responsible for someone else. And that for sometimes suicide is the terminal results of a terminal illness. And sometimes that illness is mental. People die from cancer. People die from their mental illnesses. And sometimes the form of death is suicide. So we're still coping. And my husband just came down and said that Nelson had heard me talking. He probably heard me talking about myself. So, and that he's upstairs and he's upset. So we're going to have some deep conversations this afternoon. So it's ongoing. It's ongoing.
I hate that we opened up that can of worms for you, Teresa, but
it's okay. Nelson and I got a good thing going, and we have a deep trust in each other. So we'll talk. It'll be okay. And there's no way around it. This has happened to his life. So thank you for asking, though. I appreciate your question.
With me telling my kids about my dad, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know the right time. And they always thought he was sick and just died from because he was sick. And Teresa, I don't know where you are in Virginia. I'm in Ashburn.
American.
And I felt like several years ago, it's a horrible thing. I felt like it was one child after another taking their life. And I was sick. And I'm like, I got to tell my kids. I got to tell them what happened. And my 13-year-old, who was 10 at the time, he was kind of like, okay, went on his way. He never met my father. He was born right before my father took his life. My other son, who's 16 now, he was 13, who is not a sensitive child, does not talk about his emotions. He lost it. He absolutely lost it, started crying. I can't believe he did that. He was angry, couldn't believe it. And Teresa, you know what? It's an ongoing conversation.
That's right.
And they still talk to me about it. And, it sucks. Suicide, it can happen. For me, it was back in 2007, and it still affects my life. But I have accepted it, and I handle it in a different way. So it never goes away.
Thank you for that. And by the way, Sarah just dropped off only because she had to for her son. We don't have to be concerned about her well-being at the moment. Thank you for the question, Alice Rose. Are there what else? What else can we learn from these guys? I'm just sort of taking it all in, absorbing it. I know I at least have one other teacher on the panel here who totally understands that. Yeah. Okay. So we are pretty much at the 90-minute mark anyway. So I do want to take another minute to just say thank you to all of you for being part of this. We have a couple of links in the chat for resources. Obviously, all of us are resources. If anybody has any questions or needs, it's there. I can actually say that I had a student a few years ago at Immaculata who I found out a year afterwards had committed suicide. And I wish we had this available back then and had the resources. Maybe he would have been able to ask, or maybe we would have noticed. Maybe we could have helped, been a resource. Like Teresa said, you're not 100% responsible for somebody else, and ultimately their decisions are their decisions. But it would have been nice to have had something like this. So I'm really appreciate that you're there. I'm really appreciate that the students had a chance to hear this, and hey, I'm glad that we're all connected now. Any parting words or anything for anybody before we go?
I will say that I do teach at Immaculata University. You can almost always find my email through the, start typing in J Spalding. I'll come up. If you need anything, email. I'm always available, and hopefully, praise baby Jesus, I'll be back on campus on the 19th.
And I'm also totally willing to answer any questions outside of this, or if you just want to talk, or if you know somebody, or if you want links to resources, I'd be happy to do that too. Clearly, I'm the oldest person here, so I still use Facebook and Instagram as my communication, but feel free to hit me up.
Wonderful. Well, And Randy also said she had her number is available. If anybody needs it, just hit me up, and I've got that as well. So thank you all, and I will close this out now. But again, really, really appreciate you taking the time to be our guests today on the show.
Nice to meet you guys.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Bye.
I hope he's not a mean grader.
Y'all be good.